The night begins without hurry, stretching softly across the quiet edges of the world. The light fades like an old photograph left in the window, too long, the colors drained but not forgotten. Wind moves slowly through unseen streets, through empty fields, through time itself. In that slow drift, the noise of the present begins to fade, and something older, calmer, begins to take its place. You can hear the hum of distance, the faint rhythm of the world breathing, the whisper of a story waiting to be remembered. This isn't the story of battles or kings or maps redrawn. It is something smaller, quieter, and somehow more human. It is the story of what people held in their hands when the world fell apart, what they tasted when everything else was dust and smoke. History remembers the great events, but the heart remembers the small things, the clink of a spoon, the warmth of a tin, the moment when hunger met survival. So tonight, we go there, not to relive it, but to understand how ordinary life continues even when the sky is burning. You don't need to move, just listen. The world will move for you. The room grows still, the air softens. Somewhere far away, a match is struck, a small flame flickers against a dark sky, and another night of history begins. Before a single shot was fired, before tanks rolled or planes tore open the morning sky, there was a quieter war already being fought, the war to feed an army without killing it in the process. Behind every headline, every victory, every loss, there was the same ordinary question whispered across continents. What do you eat when the world is on fire? The answer was rarely appetizing. It came in tins and boxes, in powders and pastes, in flavors that belonged to no one but necessity. But it kept millions alive. The soldiers of World War II didn't march on glory, they marched on rations, on the salt, sugar, and will that could be packed into brown paper and tin. The Americans had their K-Rations, small boxes of science and optimism sealed with wax and hope. The British carried tea and corned beef, the taste of home condensed into metal. The Germans marched on rye and sausage until both ran out and became memory. The Soviets boiled cabbage until it became more faith than food. And the Japanese soldiers, light and disciplined, survived on rice, pickled plums, and endurance that seemed carved from stone. War is often described as movement, armies pushing forward, nations colliding. But in truth, much of it was waiting, and in that waiting, people ate. They ate in trenches, in fields, in bombed-out barns, by the light of small fires or no light at all. They ate not for pleasure, but to remain human, to remind themselves that somewhere inside the noise, the routine of eating still meant they existed. Food became memory before it even reached the tongue. The smell of coffee in a foxhole, the crunch of a cracker under frozen breath, the quiet barter of chocolate for silence. These were the invisible moments that held the world together. The story of World War II can be told in strategies and dates, but there is another story underneath, one that hums beneath the surface like a low, steady heartbeat. It is the story of how survival tastes, how courage sometimes arrives not in battle but in the act of eating what you must instead of what you wish. The soldiers of every nation shared that taste, that strange communion of hunger and endurance. Across the world, from the frozen edges of the Eastern Front to the humid jungles of the Pacific, the rhythm was the same: heat, swallow, endure, move. So tonight, we drift back to that world, not the world of commanders or maps, but the quiet world of rations, tins and spoons, the world where a single bite could mean another hour, another march, another sunrise. History moves softly here, through smoke, through metal, through hunger. And if you listen closely, beneath the rustle of paper and the sigh of distant wind, you can almost hear it. the steady sound of soldiers eating in the dark, the quiet hum of life continuing against all odds. Now dim the lights, the world will slow with you. Let the air grow still. We begin with the K-Ration, the small brick of nourishment that carried men across continents, through cold and fear, through days that had forgotten the meaning of mourning. American K-Rations. The story continues with the sound of paper, the faint crack of cardboard under cold fingers, and the slow opening of a box stamped with block letters. K-Ration, breakfast, lunch, supper, small words that carried entire days of marching and waiting, entire lives reduced to compartments of measured energy. Inside each box were the same ingredients of endurance, not flavor, not comfort, but function, carefully chosen to keep the body moving while the world shook around it. Soldiers learned the contents by heart: ham and eggs compressed into a tin, dry biscuits stacked in wax paper, a packet of coffee, a tiny envelope of sugar, a stick of chewing gum, a square of chocolate wrapped like a secret, and a piece of printed paper that listed the order of the meal, as if order could exist in war. They ate sitting on crates or on the ground, their helmets turned upside down beside them, boots caked with mud, rifles leaned against their knees, and the steam of the morning drifting across the camp like a second breath. The food was never enough, and yet always there, a quiet constant in the uncertainty of the front. The tin opened with a metallic sigh, a sound that meant survival. The taste that followed was heavy and dull, but it filled the space where hunger lived. Ham and eggs that did not taste of ham or egg, biscuits that cracked like stone, coffee that smelled of somewhere else, all of it part of the strange rhythm of life away from home. Each ration carried about 3,000 calories, a scientific guess at what a human needed to keep going one more day, and behind every number there were people, unknown hands that packed, sealed, and counted, miles away from the mud and frost, factories filled with women and workers who never saw the front but fed it. In that connection there was a silent thread between those who fought and those who stayed, both surviving the same war in different ways, both trusting that the boxes would reach their destination. Some soldiers joked that the K stood for cardboard, others called it kindness in disguise, though few meant it. Yet the box became as familiar as a face, the same weight in the hand, the same smell when opened, the same taste that told you the day had begun. They ate when the whistle blew, they ate when the guns stopped, they ate in rain, in snow, in stillness, because food meant life, and life was rationed. In the evenings they sometimes traded items, a stick of gum for a chocolate bar, cigarettes for biscuits, sugar for coffee, each exchange a small reminder of home, of choice, of control. The economy of survival worked without rules, yet it kept men human. Some hoarded, some shared, and every gesture was a kind of quiet language. There was also the D-ration, a bar that looked like chocolate, but was not, made of sugar, cocoa fat, and oat flour, dense and dry, meant to survive heat and time, not to be enjoyed, but to exist. It was said that a man could live on 3 of them a day, though few ever tried. The bar was so hard it could crack a tooth, so heavy it could be used as a hammer, and yet soldiers carried it always, the last resort, the emergency hope, the sweet that was not sweet at all. When they had nothing left, they softened it over the fire or shaved it into boiling water, creating a drink that pretended to be cocoa, and for a brief moment, imagination became nourishment. When the front moved, the boxes moved too, stacked in trucks, carried by mules, dropped from planes, lost, found, traded, burned, stolen, always in motion, always part of the invisible network that kept the war alive. Somewhere between factory and foxhole, Between counting and eating, the distance between people grew smaller. The same box that one man packed, another man opened. One breathed the dust of production, the other the smoke of battle, and both waited for the same thing, the end of counting, the end of hunger. In quiet hours, when the fighting paused, soldiers improvised. They mixed biscuits with coffee, turning them into small pancakes cooked on tin lids. They melted cheese, spread into soup. They added water to powdered lemon and called it dessert. From those experiments came laughter, and from laughter came the sound of being alive. Nothing in the rations was beautiful, but the act of transforming them was. It was proof that even in the dullest meal, there was still imagination, still the desire to make something more. There were stories of men who saved the chocolate bars to send home, wrapping them again, writing a note on the inside flap, because the ration, though plain, was also a symbol, a connection across oceans. Others used the empty tins as cups, mirrors, or small stoves. Nothing was wasted because waste meant loss, and loss was already everywhere. As the war stretched on, the boxes began to change. The menus shifted, the ingredients adapted, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but always practical. The army learned that feeding men was not just about calories, but about morale. A spoonful of sugar could change the weight of a day. A taste of fruit could remind someone that life was still possible. Nutrition became psychology, science became comfort. The K-ration became a kind of diary, each one a small page in the long book of endurance. A man could remember where he ate each one, the smell of the field, the color of the sky, the sound of trucks nearby. Food made memory, and memory made identity. It was not the flavor that lasted, but the moment of stillness when the spoon met the mouth, the moment when war paused just long enough to let someone chew. In that act, there was peace, however brief. Even surrounded by noise, even when the sky glowed red with fire, a single mouthful of coffee or biscuit carried silence inside it. The world might end tomorrow, but tonight there was still warmth, still taste, still life. When the soldiers closed their eyes after the meal, their stomachs heavy, their hands still smelling of tin and smoke, the war receded for a while, replaced by dreams of kitchens, of bread, of family. The K-ration, dull and grey, became a key to those dreams, a reminder that even in the most mechanical parts of war, the human heart still searched for softness. And so, as night returned again, as fires dimmed and footsteps faded, the empty boxes lay scattered like quiet testimonies, each one a small monument to survival, to distance overcome, to hunger met and managed. The cardboard that once held food now held memory, the smell of smoke, the trace of human touch, and the quiet promise that tomorrow there would be another box, another meal, another sunrise waiting to be endured. The D-ration chocolate bar. The boxes had been opened, the tins emptied, the biscuits shared, and yet in the bottom of every bag there remained one small rectangle wrapped in wax paper, dark, heavy, and strangely quiet. The D-ration chocolate bar, a creation of necessity that looked like sweetness but was born from calculation, the invention of scientists who understood that survival sometimes needed to taste like metal. It was meant to endure heat, moisture, time and despair, a food that could travel across oceans and through fire without softening, a piece of sugar and fat pressed so tightly together that it no longer belonged to the world of food, but to the world of endurance. Soldiers carried it as they carried their weapons, not for pleasure, but for the certainty that when everything else failed, something still remained. The D-ration bar was small enough to fit into the palm of a hand, yet dense enough to feed a man for a day, its weight deceptive, its flavor almost absent, the first bite always a shock, the second a decision, the third an act of will. It was made of cocoa fat, oat flour, sugar, and a promise that it would never melt, a promise kept too well. In winter, it became A. The bar was given to soldiers as part of emergency rations, a last resort, something to be eaten only when there was nothing else, yet hunger ignored instruction, and men reached for it anyway, testing its limits, testing their own. Some broke pieces with knives, others softened it over flames, turning it into a bitter drink that passed for cocoa, the steam rising from metal cups as if from a dream of comfort. The taste was coarse, grainy, not sweet enough to soothe, not rich enough to satisfy, but after long days of marching and long nights without warmth, it was enough to quiet the body, to remind the mind that survival had its own FL. They called it the survival bar, the endurance bar, the taste of necessity. To civilians it might have seemed a small thing, but to soldiers it was a guarantee, a symbol that even in chaos someone had thought of them, had planned ahead, had tried to build a shield between them and starvation. In that way, it became more than food. It became faith in logistics, in order, in human effort. The army told them it would give 600 calories per piece, and those calories carried a strange dignity, a quiet assurance that the system still functioned. In letters home, some soldiers mentioned the bar, describing it as unbreakable, tasteless, and somehow comforting. They joked that it could stop bullets, repair machinery, or build walls. And in their jokes, there was truth, because the bar was not nourishment alone. It was a small piece of structure in a world without structure. When men had nothing to hold on to, they held the D-ration bar, and the simple weight of it in a pocket could mean one more mile, one more step, one more sunrise. On long marches, the bars were traded like currency, 3 for a pack of cigarettes, 2 for a letter from home, 1 for a story worth remembering. In trenches, they were shared in silence, small pieces broken with the tip of a knife, passed hand to hand like communion of survival, each bite a slow defiance of exhaustion. The taste lingered in the mouth like dust, but it lingered long enough to trick the stomach, and sometimes tricking was enough. At night, when fires dimmed and voices faded, men would unwrap one quietly, careful not to wake the others, and chew slowly in the dark, each bite echoing the sound of distant rain against metal, the rhythm of persistence. The sweetness, faint as memory, reminded them of kitchens left behind, of mornings without uniforms, of a world measured by flavor instead of function. For a few minutes, the bitterness turned soft, the mind forgot the cold, and the bar, designed to be unfeeling, became almost human. There were rumors about the recipe, stories passed down through platoons, that the D-ration was made deliberately unpleasant so that soldiers would not eat it too quickly, that its hardness was a test, that its taste was a lesson in restraint. No one knew for certain, and no one cared enough to ask, because by the time truth mattered, the bar was already being eaten somewhere far from factories, far from plans, far from anyone who still thought in terms of comfort. In the tropical heat of the Pacific, the bar survived what men could not, its shape unchanging while uniforms rotted and boots disintegrated, the irony not lost on anyone. Some said it was immortal, some said it was cursed, but all agreed that it worked. In frozen Europe, it cracked before it bent, the sound sharp as ice. In deserts, it burned the tongue, in jungles, it drew insects. In cities, it fed both soldiers and civilians who found it among ruins. It was everywhere, silent, reliable, indifferent. Years later, long after the war ended, veterans would remember the bar with strange affection, not because it was good, but because it was theirs. They would laugh, telling stories of teeth broken and fires started, of the taste that refused to fade, of nights when the only thing between life and nothing was that stubborn rectangle of pressed sweetness. Memory softened it, turned bitterness to nostalgia, hardness to symbol. The D-ration became the flavor of endurance, the taste of years that had no other taste. In museums now, some of those bars still exist, wrapped and sealed, unchanged by time, still solid, still waiting. Visitors look at them behind glass and see nothing remarkable. But those who once carried them know they feel the weight again in their pockets, the warmth of the hand holding it, the cold that surrounded it, the strange comfort of certainty in uncertain times. The D-ration was the purest form of war's logic: to feed without pleasure, to sustain without joy, to live without luxury. It was honest in its simplicity, and that honesty stayed with those who survived. When peace came and real chocolate returned, men found it too sweet, too soft, too unreal, and in that moment they realized that war had changed even their tongues. So the D-ration chocolate bar, born of science and scarcity, became a quiet monument, not made of stone or bronze, but of memory, a reminder that survival is sometimes flavorless, sometimes hard, sometimes silent, yet still sacred in its own way. It represented the stubborn will to continue, the strength that hides in the smallest forms, the faith that someone, somewhere, had planned for hunger. And as the night deepens and the story drifts onward, the image remains: a soldier in the dark, unwrapping a small bar, lifting it to his lips, chewing slowly while the world trembles, and the taste of endurance spreads across his tongue like a slow heartbeat. Around him, the air is still, the fire barely glows, and history pauses for a breath, caught between bitterness and survival, between what was endured and what was left behind. Field kitchens and warm food. Beyond the rations and the bars, there was another presence that followed the soldiers like a quiet companion. The field kitchen, a place that moved on wheels and smoke, a traveling heart of warmth that pulsed through the cold lines of war. It carried not comfort, but memory, a reminder that food could still be hot, that life could still have a scent. The field kitchens were built from iron and canvas, heavy stoves fixed onto trailers, their wheels cutting deep into mud, their chimneys trailing smoke that could be seen for miles. They arrived behind the troops when the noise of battle faded and the wind carried the smell of wood and grease instead of fire and blood. Men would turn their heads toward that smoke, the way travelers turn toward light at dusk, because it meant a meal, a pause, the soft weight of steam against the skin. The cooks worked through everything, through rain that blurred their sight and snow that bit their fingers. They stirred great pots of stew with spoons longer than their arms, their faces red with heat, their coats shining with fat and smoke. They were soldiers too, but their weapons were ladles, and their victories were measured in bowls filled and bodies warmed. Around them, the world always looked softer, the edges less sharp. The meals they made were not elaborate, only beans, meat, bread, broth, and coffee. But in those elements lay the architecture of survival. Soldiers lined up with tin trays and helmets held out like offerings, waiting for a scoop of heat that might chase away the cold that lived inside their bones. The first taste was always the same: shock, followed by calm, the heat spreading through the chest, the salt waking something almost forgotten. In Europe, the kitchens burned wood, scavenged from broken fences, furniture, crates, anything that could turn to flame. In the desert, they burned fuel oil and sand hissed against the pots. In the jungle, they burned roots and green leaves that filled the air with sweet smoke. No matter the place, the ritual never changed. The cooks began before dawn, the soldiers gathered at dusk, the sound of ladles scraping against the bottom of metal pots, marking the rhythm of a temporary peace. Sometimes the food was ruined, spoiled by rain, or tainted by dust, and yet even then men ate, laughing at the taste, because laughter tasted better than hunger. They learned to drink from dented cups that burned their hands, to swallow coffee that smelled of smoke and soap, to chew bread that had been baked weeks before. The act of eating became a reminder that they were still men, not only parts of a machine. The field kitchen became a gathering place, a kind of slow heartbeat in the moving world of the army. There was talk there, low and unhurried, the sharing of stories, of rumors, of moments of silence that did not need to be filled. The cooks listened more than they spoke. They served quietly, and by doing so, they made the space feel safe. In war, that was rare. At night, when the fires dimmed and the pots cooled, the last steam rose into the dark like ghosts of warmth, drifting across sleeping camps. The soldiers slept near the scent of the kitchen because it reminded them of home, of kitchens that did not move, of tables that did not fold, of mothers and wives and children waiting somewhere under another sky. For a few hours the illusion was enough. In the morning, frost would form on the lids, the spoons would freeze to the handles, and the cooks would light the fires again, their hands wrapped in cloth, their breath visible in the smoke. They did not wait for orders, they simply worked, because hunger did not wait either. The coffee they brewed was thick, sometimes black as ink, sometimes grey as rainwater, but always hot. It poured into tin cups that rattled against one another, a chorus of small sounds that filled the empty spaces between words. The first sip burned the tongue, the second soothed the mind, the third returned something like thought. Men could talk again after coffee, they could plan, they could believe the day might end. There were times when the kitchens had to move under cover of night, when the noise of trucks was muffled and lights were hidden under tarps, and yet even then, someone found time to warm a pot, to stir, to serve, to hand another man a bowl and nod. The gesture meant everything. In the deepest winter, when snow fell for days and the sun did not rise, the kitchens became sanctuaries of heat. Men crowded near them, boots steaming, gloves stiff, rifles leaning in rows. The stew bubbled slowly, chunks of potato surfacing like memory. There was always too little meat, too much water, and still it was enough. The spoon scraped the bottom and came up shining, and someone whispered, "Thank you," without sound. In summer, when dust coated every surface and the air shimmered with heat, the kitchens worked under canvas, sweat dripping into pots, flies thick as smoke. The cooks worked bare-armed, their movements slow and steady, stirring the same mixture again and again. The soldiers came with canteens, with bowls, with open hands, and left with food that was both heavy and precious. Sometimes music played from a distant radio, broken, half static, half melody, the kind that did not need to be understood. The sound wove into the smell of grease and coffee, into the murmur of men eating, into the clatter of spoons, creating a small world that did not belong to war at all. When battles grew close, the kitchens moved further back, their smoke swallowed by distance. The men on the front line received only tins, cold and silent. They dreamed of the kitchens, of the cooks, of the simple act of standing in line with a plate and feeling heat on their face. The memory of that warmth was stronger than the food itself. It became a direction, something to walk toward when everything else fell apart. For many, the cooks were invisible, yet their work touched every soldier. They fed thousands and still remembered faces who liked more salt, who always came last, who traded sugar for soup. They saw war in its smallest moments, the hunger behind the bravery, the silence behind the orders. They became witnesses to humanity that refused to vanish, and in their quiet service there was something almost holy, though no prayers were spoken. When the war ended and the kitchens were dismantled, the smell of them stayed in memory. Veterans would later recall not the feasts of victory, but the thin stews of survival, not the banquets, but the coffee poured by tired hands. They remembered the warmth on cold mornings, the sight of smoke in the distance, the way the ladle moved in slow circles, steady, patient, constant. Even now, in the stories of old soldiers, the field kitchen returns, always the same, always humble, always waiting behind the noise. It is the symbol of endurance that is gentle, the kind that does not shout, the kind that feeds rather than fights. It represents a truth older than any battle, that warmth shared is stronger than strength alone, that to give food is to give time, and to give time is to give life. And so the field kitchens roll on in memory, wheels turning through fields that have long grown quiet, pots empty now but still echoing with the sound of ladles, the smell of soup, the slow breath of smoke against cold air. In that faint image, under the endless sky, the war softens into something human, and history folds into silence, as if resting after a long meal. German rations and their decline. At the beginning of the war, the German soldier marched with full packs and full stomachs, his rations carefully planned, his bread baked from heavy rye, his sausage spiced and rich, his butter thick and yellow, his coffee dark and bitter, strong enough to remind him of home. The field kitchens behind him carried dumplings, cabbage, soup, and even small cakes. The air around the camps smelled of salt, meat, and smoke, and for a time it seemed that food would remain certain even when the world was not. The German army prided itself on efficiency, and the ration was a reflection of that pride, balanced, measured, almost elegant in its order. Each soldier carried in his kit a day's worth of life: bread, sausage, cheese, butter, marmalade, coffee, sugar, sometimes chocolate, sometimes fruit, everything labeled, wrapped, precise. The bread was dense and dark, made to last a week, hardening each day until it became both food and tool used to scrape, to slice, to measure time. The sausage, thick and oily, smelled faintly of pepper and smoke. It could be eaten raw or boiled, sliced or spread. And for many, it was the taste of Germany itself, the comfort that connected camp to home. The butter came in small tins, the cheese wrapped in paper, the marmalade sealed in glass, and together they formed not a feast, but a routine, the rhythm of nourishment that followed discipline. In the early months, when victory came easily and supply lines stretched wide across Europe, food was plentiful. Trains carried meat, grain, and vegetables from farms and towns under German control. Field kitchens boiled rich stews, the officers ate hot meals on white plates, and the soldiers sang between bites of bread. They believed this order would hold. They believed the system was unbreakable. But wars do not feed themselves, and as time lengthened, the front lines spread thin, and the distance between kitchens and soldiers grew like a wound. Supplies slowed, fields burned, roads collapsed under snow, and the rations began to change. The bread turned pale, the flour mixed with fillers, starch, barley, sawdust, even ground acorns. The sausage shrank, its fat replaced by water and scraps. The butter became grey and odourless, the cheese turned sour, the marmalade disappeared. What remained was something that looked like food, but no longer felt alive. In the bitter winters of the Eastern Front, the soldiers fought not only the enemy, but the cold and the emptiness of their own bellies. The field kitchens froze, their smoke hidden from the sky, their pots filled with frozen meat that took hours to thaw. Sometimes there was no meat, only bones boiled for flavor, only broth stretched to serve hundreds. The men ate in silence, steam rising from their bowls, their faces hollow and white. Hunger made them slower, quieter, older. They learned to cook whatever they could find: turnips, beets, potatoes, half rotten from frost, bark peeled from trees, even the bread of the fallen. They traded cigarettes for crumbs, scraped the frost from walls for water, melted snow into soup that tasted of iron. The proud order of the ration book dissolved into improvisation, into survival. The German army that had once been the image of precision now relied on chance. Somewhere far from the front, in cities untouched by battle, propaganda still showed soldiers eating well, smiling, healthy, but the truth at the front was smaller and colder. A soldier might carry a single crust of bread wrapped in paper, or a tin of horse meat labeled ersatz, substitute. Ersatz became the word of the age. Ersatz bread, ersatz butter, ersatz coffee, ersatz hope. Even flavor became imitation. Coffee was brewed from roasted barley or acorns, its bitterness thin, its warmth fleeting. Men joked about it, but their laughter was soft and short. At night, the officers still received real food: sausages, wine, preserved vegetables, but even that began to fade. The cook stretched meals with water, thickened soups with flour, used the same bones for days. The smell of real food became rare, a memory that haunted dreams. When soldiers wrote home, they no longer described battles, they described hunger. Letters became lists of absence: no bread, no meat, no coffee, no warmth. In the snow of Russia, men carried frozen bread in their coats, sleeping with it to keep it from turning to stone. They broke it with the butts of their rifles, soaking it in melted snow before chewing. The sausage, once rich, now tasted of salt and smoke and nothing else. Some tried to cook it in helmets, the fat burning black, the smell filling the air for miles, dangerous but irresistible. Food was risk, and men took it. The cold made even eating an effort. Fingers cracked, lips bled, spoons froze to metal tins. Coffee cooled before it could be swallowed. And yet every meal was sacred in its way because it meant one more day alive. Hunger turned them inward. It stripped away ranks, titles, and pride. Around a pot of thin soup, everyone was the same, waiting for warmth that came too little and left too soon. As the war turned, as retreat began, food disappeared almost entirely. Rations arrived late or never. Men looted villages not from cruelty but from need. A loaf of bread became more valuable than ammunition. A handful of salt was treasure. They carried what they could steal or trade, ate what they found, and what they found was often not enough. By the final years, the German ration was no longer a system but a memory. The official list still existed, printed with care: bread, meat, fat, sugar. But they had become words without meaning. The soldiers learned to live on hunger itself, the body shrinking into its own endurance, the mind focused only on movement. When food appeared, it was a miracle. When it did not, they continued anyway. In letters written after the war, veterans often said that they remembered not battles but meals. The first good one, the last decent one, the ones they imagined but never ate. They remembered the sound of soup boiling, the smell of bread before it froze, the quiet moment of eating before moving again. Hunger became the language through which they remembered everything else. And yet, even in those last months, the field kitchens still moved. Cooks still stirred, still served, still stood beside fires that barely burned. They did what they could with what they had. They boiled turnips until they dissolved, thickened water with flour, added scraps of bone for taste. They understood that their work no longer changed the course of war, but it still mattered. It gave men a reason to stop, to gather, to live one more hour. When the war ended and the survivors returned, many spoke of the taste of substitute bread, of the smell of ersatz coffee, of the faint sweetness of marmalade that had once been real. They said that food became a kind of memory that outlasted orders, that hunger became a shape of time, that endurance was measured not in victories, but in bites swallowed against the cold. In the ruins of cities, as peace crept back through the smoke, the ovens lit again, bread baked again, and for the first time in years, the smell of real flour filled the air. Those who lived through the hunger said they could never forget it, and they never wasted food again. They ate slowly, reverently, as if each meal were a kind of silence, a soft echo of the years when warmth was a dream. And so the story of German rations is not only about decline, it is about transformation, about how food, even in its poorest form, became the last bridge between despair and endurance. How a spoonful of thin soup could hold a man upright against the cold wind of history. How the smallest taste could remind the heart to keep beating. The Eastern Front and starvation. The winter on the Eastern Front came like a wall, silent at first, then absolute, a season that devoured sound and light until only cold remained, stretching endlessly across plains of white and smoke. The soldiers moved through it like ghosts, their breath rising in clouds that froze in the air, their bodies wrapped in layers of cloth that no longer kept the chill away, and beneath everything, hunger waited, patient and sure. It was the quietest enemy, the one that needed no weapon, only time. The snow covered everything, the trenches, the roads, the dead, and the living learned to dig into it as if into the body of the earth itself. Firewood was gone, food was gone, the supply lines were long and broken. Trucks sank into drifts, horses fell and froze where they landed. The field kitchens tried to keep up, their pots frozen solid, their fuel gone, their cooks stirring with numb hands at food that no longer boiled. The air smelled of metal and silence, the kind of stillness that made every movement feel heavy, every thought slow. The soldiers ate what they could find, bread frozen like rock, sliced with bayonets, soaked in water melted from snow, chewed slowly until it became warmth again. They boiled potatoes until they fell apart, added cabbage, added anything that could be called food. When there was no meat, they boiled bones. When there were no bones, they boiled water, hoping for the illusion of flavor. Some carried small tins of fat, saved and guarded, scraped with spoons like gold. Hunger became ritual, a routine that replaced all others. They shared what little they had, dividing portions with the precision of survival. No one took more than his share, not because of discipline, but because greed had no energy left to exist. The act of eating became quiet and slow, almost meditative, a moment when the world shrank to the space between spoon and mouth. Around each pot, men gathered close, not to speak, but to feel each other's presence, to borrow warmth from nearness. The snow fell without sound, the sky stayed grey for weeks, then months. The men stopped measuring days by sunrise and sunset because the light no longer changed. They measured time by meals, by hunger, by the sound of something boiling, by the smell of bread when there was bread, by its absence when there was not. In the frozen fields, food convoys tried to arrive, but the roads were gone, the bridges broken, the rivers frozen solid. Some drivers burned part of their own cargo for heat. Others never arrived. When the trucks did appear on the horizon, men watched them as if seeing ghosts, their engines coughing, their wheels turning in slow agony. The food they carried was already cold, already solid, already half gone. There were stories whispered through the camps of men who found barrels of pickled cabbage buried under snow, of abandoned farms where grain still slept in silos, of trains that froze mid-journey, their cargo locked inside by ice. These were not miracles, only delays of hunger, small interruptions in the inevitable. The men learned not to believe in plenty, only in enough. The body began to change first. Fingers lost their feeling, skin turned pale and cracked, stomachs tightened. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and uneasy. The sound of the stomach growling became part of the air. The face thinned, the voice quieted, even laughter became soft and short, because to laugh too long hurt the ribs. When food did come, it came late, it came cold, it came in portions that mocked the size of need. A spoonful of stew, a sliver of bread, a sip of tea that was only hot water, and colour. Yet the men still sat together, still ate in order, still waited for one another before lifting spoons. Hunger had stripped away everything except the thin thread of shared existence. The officers wrote reports about logistics, about calories and supply ratios, about replacement units and rations delivered, but the reports were numbers without life. On the ground, the food was not data, it was survival in its smallest form. A crust of bread could mean another hour of endurance. A cup of broth could mean the difference between walking and falling. The men no longer thought in days, they thought in spoons. The cold deepened, frost built up on rifles, froze the oil inside them, and still men carried them, because carrying meant belonging, meant purpose. Some used rifles as walking sticks, others as firewood when no one was watching. There were no rules left that hunger could not bend. At night, under the low canvas of frozen tents, the men dreamt of food, not feasts, not luxury, just bread, soup, coffee, warmth. The dreams were vivid, more vivid than waking, and when they opened their eyes, the absence of those things was almost pain. Some laughed softly at the dreams, others stopped mentioning them at all, as if speaking of warmth could drive it further away. Hunger erased anger, erased ambition, erased fear. It left behind something quieter, a kind of still endurance that had no language. The men stopped thinking of victory or defeat. They thought of the next hour, the next piece of bread, the next sip of water. Each day became a small survival, repeated endlessly until the repetition itself became life. When spring finally came, it did not bring relief. The thaw turned snow to mud, and mud swallowed what the snow had hidden. The supplies that arrived were spoiled, the rivers flooded, the earth itself seemed tired of feeding men. Yet in that exhaustion there was also change. Green returned, weak at first, then brighter. The first shoots appeared on the horizon, and the men watched them with disbelief, as if seeing something forbidden. The world was alive again, but so slowly that they barely trusted it. Those who survived the winter never forgot its silence. They spoke of it later, not as suffering, but as stillness, a stillness so complete that it felt like truth. They said that in the hunger they learned something about time, that it does not move forward or back, it only waits like them for the next meal, the next warmth, the next breath. When they returned home, years later, they carried the memory of hunger like a shadow. They ate slowly, carefully, never wasting, never hurrying. They remembered the shape of snow against a tin bowl, the sound of frozen bread breaking, the sight of steam rising from a single spoonful of soup. They did not speak of it often, but it lived inside them, quiet and unending, a reminder that life once balanced on the edge of an empty plate. The Eastern Front was not only a battlefield, it was a landscape of endurance, a geography of hunger. The men who crossed it carried its silence forever. The sound of wind over ice, the rhythm of spoons against empty tins, the taste of frost instead of flavor. And though the maps changed and the wars ended, that silence remained, floating somewhere above the snow, timeless, indifferent, infinite. Soviet rations, and cabbage persistence. The Soviet soldier marched beneath a different sky, grey and endless, the kind of sky that did not promise anything, not warmth, not light, only duration. His world was measured in kilometers and hunger, in steam that rose from metal pots and froze before it could fade. The Soviet ration was simple, often the simplest thing that could be called food: bread, cabbage, potatoes, a little salt, sometimes a spoon of fat, sometimes nothing at all. It was not designed for comfort, it was designed for survival, for motion, for endurance, in a landscape where everything else stopped moving. Cabbage was the foundation of that endurance. It appeared in every form and season, fresh when it could be, sour when it couldn't, salted, boiled, pickled, stewed, dried, fermented. It filled the air with a smell that clung to coats, hands and tents, a smell that was both life and exhaustion. In the Soviet field kitchens, cauldrons of cabbage soup, shchi, boiled day and night, thick or thin depending on what was left. The sound of it simmering became part of the rhythm of the front, steady, constant, uncomplaining. Bread was rationed by weight, sometimes 600 grams a day, sometimes less, often made with barley, bran, or even sawdust when flour ran out. The soldiers lined up for it silently, their faces pale in the cold, their hands already trembling from fatigue. They carried the bread in cloth, undercoats, inside helmets, anything to keep it from freezing. A crust was treasure. A crumb was memory. The bread gave strength for one more march, one more trench, one more breath. There was also kasha, the boiled grain that could be anything: buckwheat, millet, barley, cooked with water or with nothing but patience. It filled stomachs even when it filled no hunger. Men ate it slowly, spoon after spoon, steam rising into their faces like the ghost of warmth. Some added pieces of cabbage to stretch it further, others stirred in melted fat if they had it, though most did not. When meat arrived, it was rare and precious, cut into small cubes, dropped into boiling water that turned grey with the first bubbles. Sometimes it was hoarse, sometimes something unspoken. They called it meat and did not ask further. The flavor did not matter. What mattered was heat, salt, movement of the jaw, the act of continuing. Cabbage endured where men could not. It grew in soil bombed and burned. It survived frost. It could be stored through winter in barrels that smelled of vinegar and iron. It was the quiet miracle of the Eastern Front, the food that refused to vanish. Every soldier knew its taste, sour, sharp, alive. They cursed it, laughed about it, but they needed it. In a war that took everything, cabbage remained. The Soviet field kitchens were small iron boxes on wheels, dragged behind trucks or horses, sometimes pushed by men through the mud. Inside them, smoke and steam mixed until they were the same thing. The cooks, always calm, always tired, worked without pause, stirring, tasting, adjusting with instinct more than ingredients. They were as much soldiers as the men they fed, fighting their own war against distance, cold, and shortage. They made miracles from nothing, turning frozen potatoes into soup, cabbage water into meal, air into promise. In the mornings, when frost still covered the ground, the smell of boiling soup spread through the camp like news. Men rose slowly, boots stiff, hands numb, drawn toward that scent. They did not speak much. They waited with bowls in hand, watching the ladle move, watching steam lift and fade. It was the one moment of the day that still resembled life before war, the moment when a body was warmed from inside. The portions were small, but they were shared with discipline. Soldiers learned to eat slowly, to savor what little there was, to take pleasure in the smallest things, the crunch of bread crust, the first sip of soup, the taste of salt when it appeared. Hunger taught them reverence. Each meal became a prayer without words. When the fighting grew intense, rations disappeared entirely. The kitchens could not move forward, the lines too long, the roads too broken. Soldiers carried dry biscuits, sometimes sugar, sometimes nothing. They boiled snow, chewed raw grain, dreamed of the smell of cabbage and smoke. Hunger became a companion again, quiet and certain, sitting beside them through every night. In the cities under siege, like Leningrad, cabbage was more valuable than gold. People ate it until none remained, then boiled its leaves, then its roots, then the barrels that once held it. The soldiers who fought near those cities sent their own rations when they could, even though they had little. It was the simplest act of humanity, one hunger feeding another. Despite everything, Soviet morale did not vanish, it transformed. Hunger turned into unity, the shared effort of endurance. Men joked that cabbage would win the war because it could not die, and in a way, it did. It fed millions when nothing else could, carried by trains, by carts, by hands. It grew again and again in the black earth, and in that repetition lay a kind of faith, not in ideology, not in victory, but in the stubborn will of life itself. When the war began to turn, when supplies improved, when meat returned and bread became real again, the soldiers still asked for cabbage soup. They said it tasted like home, even when home no longer existed. It reminded them of survival, of something they had overcome without fully understanding how. The cook smiled and kept making it, stirring as they had always done, quiet, patient, enduring. After the war, when veterans gathered in villages and towns, when they told stories beside stoves and shared glasses of vodka, they spoke often of food, of bread, of cabbage, of soup. They spoke of it not with bitterness, but with strange affection, because it had kept them alive. They laughed at their hunger, at the endless bowls of shchi, at the taste that had never left their mouths. In that laughter there was gratitude, and in that gratitude there was peace. Even today, in quiet kitchens across the old country, old men still cook cabbage soup the same way. They stir it slowly, tasting as they go, adding salt, remembering the steam on frozen mornings, the smell of smoke and frost, the feel of the bowl in cold hands. They do not speak of war, they do not need to. The soup speaks for them. The story of Soviet rations is not one of despair, but of persistence, of how the simplest food can carry the greatest weight, of how a single vegetable became a thread between life and death, between hunger and hope. In the quiet rhythm of boiling cabbage, history still breathes softly, endlessly, patient as steam. Allied, convoys and frozen seas. Far to the north, where the sea froze before dawn and ships moved slower than thought, another front existed, one made not of trenches or cities, but of distance, the long grey stretch between hunger and delivery. The Allied convoys crossed that space, carrying food, fuel and warmth to those who could no longer find it for themselves. They sailed through waters that swallowed light, where the horizon blurred into ice, where silence could turn to thunder in a heartbeat. The men aboard did not march or dig. They waited, surrounded by cold, surrounded by motion that never truly moved. The ships were heavy with cargo: wheat, meat, sugar, milk, canned vegetables, powdered eggs, flour packed in barrels, coffee sealed in tins. Each item was small, ordinary, unremarkable on its own, but together they became survival, entire nations floating across frozen seas. The convoys were slow, long lines of ships connected by invisible faith, by the belief that movement itself was enough. The ocean was the enemy now, the cold its weapon. On deck, The wind cut like glass. Men wrapped in layers of wool and oilskin worked quietly, their faces rimmed with frost, their breath turning white in the air. The sea growled beneath them, breaking against steel, spraying salt that froze on railings and ropes. The noise was constant, yet inside the noise there was a strange peace, a rhythm that lulled even fear. Each wave meant forward, each gust of wind another hour survived. Below deck, the cargo shifted with the swell, the wooden crates knocking softly against one another like distant drums. The men could feel it even in sleep, the slow heartbeat of the ship, the sound of food moving through darkness toward the hungry. They did not know who would eat what they carried, only that it mattered, that it must arrive. The knowledge gave weight to their silence. The Arctic convoys bound for Murmansk and Archangel were the most perilous, moving through nights that lasted months, through storms that split ships in half, through the sightless calm of snow and sea blended into one. They sailed in columns, destroyers guarding them like shepherds, aircraft above when weather allowed, but more often alone under a sky without stars. Ice formed on the decks, thick and white. Men broke it with hammers to keep the ships from capsizing. They worked in silence, their gloves stiff, their eyes half closed against the wind. The enemy was always near, unseen beneath the water. Submarines moved through the black like shadows, torpedoes gliding soundlessly until impact. Sometimes the men never saw it coming, only heard the sudden split of metal, the rush of water, the groan of a ship breaking apart. The sea swallowed everything quickly, crates, voices, heat, names. Survivors clung to rafts, to barrels, to one another, their breath turning to mist before fading. Those who were pulled from the water were half frozen already, their skin grey, their hands locked into fists they could not open. And yet the convoys kept sailing. The ships that remained closed their ranks, tightened their formation, and continued forward. There was no time to stop because stopping meant death. The ocean took what it wanted and gave nothing back. The men learned not to look behind them. They watched the horizon instead, counting the faint flashes of light that meant another ship still moved. In the rare moments of calm, when the wind softened and the sea flattened, the world turned almost kind. The ice gleamed under moonlight, the sky stretched open and silent, and the ships looked small but unbroken. The men stood at the railings, smoking, their breath rising like ghosts, watching the endless white. They spoke of home, of warm meals, of the smell of bread. They spoke softly, not because they feared the enemy, but because the vastness of the sea demanded respect. Below deck, the cooks worked with whatever they had. The stoves burned weakly, the metal cold even beside the flame. They made coffee that was more water than taste, stew that was more salt than meat, bread that never rose properly in the damp air. And yet the smell of it filled the ship, cutting through oil and rust, reminding the men of something human. The first bite was always too hot, the second too cold, but it was food, and food was memory. Each convoy carried hundreds of thousands of tons of life. To those waiting at the other end, each crate meant something different: a week of meals for a village, a canteen filled for soldiers, a piece of normalcy. To those aboard, it meant survival measured by miles. Every time they looked at the cargo, they saw what it could become: warmth in another man's hand. The cold had a way of making time disappear. Days merged into one long twilight. The clocks still turned, but no one trusted them. The men marked time by meals, by watches on deck, by the rhythm of the engines. When the sea froze around them, when the ship slowed, they took turns breaking the ice that clung to ropes and rails, the work endless and slow, the sound of hammers echoing through fog. Sometimes, when the convoy reached the narrow fjords of the north, the sun appeared for an hour or two, weak but golden, touching the surface of the water like forgiveness. The men stood still and looked at it, not speaking, as if sunlight was something fragile that could shatter if disturbed. For that brief moment, they forgot the noise of engines, the taste of salt, the endless grey. They felt warmth again, faint but real. When they reached port, the unloading began immediately. The docks were lined with cranes, with men shouting through scarves, with carts and horses waiting in snow. The crates were lifted, stacked, counted, carried away. There was no ceremony, no pause, only relief. The food vanished into trains and trucks within hours, disappearing toward the front lines, toward those who had waited all winter. The sailors watched it go, their faces unreadable, their hands raw from cold. They knew their work was done when the holds were empty, when only the smell of grain and salt remained. Then they turned and sailed back into the same sea, to do it again, to carry more, to endure more. The cycle was endless, as if the ocean itself demanded repetition, as if the act of bringing food had become a form of faith. The men never called it that, but it was. Each voyage was a prayer made of steel and salt, each delivery a small miracle of motion through impossible silence. Years later, when the war was over and the oceans calmed, the sailors remembered the cold more than the fear, the quiet more than the sound. They remembered the faces of men outlined in frost, the glow of cigarettes in the dark, the distant hum of engines under ice. They remembered the taste of salt that never left their mouths, the smell of bread that never quite returned. They remembered not victory, but endurance. In the museums of northern ports, some of those ships are remembered still, their names carved into walls, their stories told in low voices. Visitors walk past the photographs of frozen men, the maps of icy routes, the displays of tins and boxes. Few stop to think about the food itself, about what it meant to those who never saw it but lived because of it. The ships were not symbols of power, but of persistence, of the quiet movement that keeps the world alive when everything. And so the convoys became part of history. A long procession of steel and smoke across frozen seas, carrying warmth through darkness, carrying life through silence, the sound of their engines fading now into memory, like the slow heartbeat of a world that refused to let itself starve. The return home and forgotten hunger. When the war finally ended, it did not end all at once. It faded. The noise receded first, then the light returned. And after the smoke cleared, what remained was silence, a silence so deep that even birds seemed unsure how to fill it. The soldiers came home through that silence, walking slowly, carrying what little they had left, their packs lighter than their memories, their eyes searching for familiar shapes in a world that had forgotten how to look back. The cities were half standing, the fields half grown, and the people half believing that peace had really come. For many, the first thing they noticed was the smell not of gunpowder or oil, but of bread, real bread, baked fresh, soft under the crust, still warm enough to let steam rise when broken. That smell filled entire streets. It floated through doorways and windows, and men stopped walking just to breathe it in. Some wept without sound, some smiled and touched the walls of bakeries like they were touching life itself. Hunger had been their teacher, and now they stood in front of its opposite, almost afraid to believe it would last. Food had changed. It was no longer rationed, no longer counted by grams or calories or distance. Markets reopened, apples rolled in baskets, milk shone white again, butter returned to yellow. The sight of abundance made people quiet, as if too much color after too much gray felt strange. They filled their tables carefully, still cutting portions small, still saving crumbs, still folding paper twice before throwing it away. The war had ended, but its habits remained. In kitchens that had once been cold, fires burned again, pots boiled, knives scraped against cutting boards, laughter returned in the shape of conversation. Families gathered around tables that had been empty for years, their movements awkward at first, like remembering a forgotten dance. They served soup and bread and meat, simple things that felt extraordinary. The first meals of peace were eaten slowly, reverently, every bite a remembrance of what had been missing. Some soldiers could not eat much at first. Their stomachs, shrunk by years of rationing, rebelled against plenty. They took small bites, chewed carefully, swallowed with care. The body had learned hunger as a language, and it needed time to learn silence again. Others could not stop eating, as if they feared it might vanish once more. They filled their plates, filled their mouths, filled the emptiness inside them that no victory could cure. And in that act there was no shame, only recovery, only proof that they were still here. Farmers returned to their land, found it scarred, yet alive. They planted again, ploughed again, trusting the earth to forget the weight of boots and shells. In the spring, the first green appeared like forgiveness. Wheat rose through soil that had known blood. The world began to feed itself again. In cities, ration books were collected, stamped one last time, then stored in drawers as relics of a vanished order. Children who had grown up under hunger touched them curiously, unable to imagine what those papers had meant. The adults said nothing because words could not contain those years. They could only cook and serve and eat, hoping that taste could explain what language could not. Cafes reopened, their tables uneven, their cups mismatched, but full. People sat together again, sipping coffee that was real, not made of barley or chicory, and with each sip, the bitterness of the past softened. Strangers nodded to one another, sharing small smiles over sugar cubes that melted too quickly. Music returned to the air, slow, hesitant, but alive. And yet, the memory of hunger lingered. It hid in gestures, the way a person reached for bread before conversation, the way they scraped a plate clean, the way they saved what could not be eaten for later. The war had changed the rhythm of eating. It had made food sacred, ordinary, and eternal all at once. To waste became unthinkable, to share became instinct. At night, people dreamed of tables, not of battles or bombs, but of tables set under quiet lamps, of soup steaming, of hands passing salt. These dreams were not grand, but they were full. They were the dreams of those who had lived without enough and now found that enough was the greatest gift. Some could not stay in cities. They left for the countryside, for the smell of wet earth, for the silence between meals. They said they could not eat surrounded by walls that had heard too much fear. They built small homes, grew gardens, kept chickens. They found peace in the slow routine of feeding themselves. To them, every meal was a ceremony, every loaf of bread a small resurrection. The soldiers who had crossed oceans and deserts, who had eaten from tins and boxes, now sat at tables with plates of porcelain and spoons that did not bend. The first time they tasted hot soup from a real bowl, some closed their eyes because the warmth was almost too much. It reminded them of what they had lost, but also of what had survived. The simple act of swallowing became a kind of prayer, not to any god of war or victory, but to the quiet mercy of survival itself. Time passed, and hunger became memory. But memory is stubborn. It hides in corners, it waits behind flavor. When people smelled cabbage, they remembered cold. When they tasted coffee, they remembered waiting. When they saw bread rise in the oven, they remembered the hollow feeling that had lived inside their bodies for years. These memories did not hurt anymore, they humbled. Children grew up hearing fragments, how bread once froze in the air, how coffee once came from roasted seeds, how soup once held more water than taste. They listened, then ran off to play, never understanding that these stories were not about food but about endurance. And that was good. It meant the world had healed enough to forget. In the decades that followed, hunger turned into history, a subject for books, for museums, for voices that spoke in the past tense. But for those who had lived it, the feeling never left entirely. They still paused before the first bite. They still thanked quietly inside, not in words, but in breath. They had learned what abundance truly meant, and it was not luxury, it was the absence of fear. Old men sitting by windows would sometimes smile at the sight of a bakery or at the smell of soup carried by wind. They would close their eyes and see again the grey mornings, the cold hands, the steam rising from a tin cup. They would see not misery, but proof that they had endured, that the world had continued, that even hunger could not stop the rhythm of life. And in that understanding there was peace, not triumph, not pride, just peace, the kind that comes after long waiting, the kind that tastes faintly of salt and warmth, the kind that asks for nothing more. Memory of taste and the quiet generation. The years after peace were quiet, the noise of the world had been turned down, and what replaced it was gentler, the sound of living instead of surviving. A new generation grew up among full cupboards and warm kitchens, children who never counted bread or watched their parents divide meals by candlelight. They lived surrounded by the smell of abundance, by sugar in glass jars, by apples stored in cellars, by the easy certainty that food would always be there. To them, hunger was a story, distant, unreal, something that belonged to old photographs and careful voices. Their parents did not correct them. They smiled when the children left food on plates, when they asked for more, and then forgot to eat it, when they laughed at stories of ration cards and boiled cabbage. It was better this way. Forgetting was a kind of healing. Yet memory does not vanish completely. It hides in habits, in small gestures, in the way someone saves the heel of a loaf or pours water over every last grain of rice. These quiet remnants lived in every household, invisible but present, like echoes beneath calm. In the post-war years, food became more than sustenance. It became proof that life had gone on. Kitchens grew larger, stoves more modern, recipes more ambitious, markets filled with colors that had been missing for decades. Oranges, once exotic, sat in bowls as if they had never been gone. Butter returned to golden light, sugar to sparkle, and milk to softness. People ate not just to live, but to remember how it felt to live freely. Every meal became a small act of gratitude, though the words were never spoken aloud. The quiet generation that followed inherited the fullness without the fear. They learned the recipes but not the reasons behind them. They cooked because it was tradition, not because it was survival. Their homes smelled of comfort but not of struggle. They could not imagine the cold taste of snow melted for soup, or the way bread hardened in a soldier's hand before it reached his mouth. They could not know, and they were not meant to. That ignorance was a blessing born of sacrifice. Still, when the older ones spoke, their stories always found their way back to food. They never described battles or victories first, they described what they ate. The way bread sounded when broken, the way soup steamed under frost, the way a piece of chocolate could feel like sunlight. Their words were slow and tender, heavy with the rhythm of memory. The young listened politely, not understanding, nodding when they were supposed to, smiling when the stories ended. And yet something lingered. The idea that taste itself could hold history, that the body could remember what the mind had never known. Some evenings, when the world outside was quiet, the old ones cooked as they once had, simply, slowly, with the same ingredients that had kept them alive long ago. They peeled potatoes without hurry, chopped cabbage with the care of ritual, stirred soup until it hummed softly. They called it habit, but it was more than that. It was remembrance made visible. The smell filled their homes with a peace deeper than comfort, a peace born from knowing how easily it could all disappear. The quiet generation watched them and learned something without realizing it. They learned patience from the way water boiled, gratitude from the way bread was sliced evenly, reverence from the silence that settled over the table before the first bite. They learned that life was not measured by what one owned, but by how one used what one had. It was a slow lesson, but it stayed. Decades passed, the world grew faster, louder, brighter. Machines replaced hands, food became easier, quicker, cheaper. Hunger faded further into the distance, and memory followed it. Yet somewhere beneath the hum of refrigerators and the glow of kitchen lights, the old rhythm persisted. The sound of a spoon stirring, the steam rising from a bowl, the act of sharing. These remained. Even those who never knew hardship still paused sometimes before eating, sensing something sacred in the simple act of nourishment. The people who had known hunger aged quietly. They did not tell their stories often anymore. They kept them folded away like letters never sent. But sometimes, in moments between conversation, a scent would catch them, a flavor would return, and their eyes would soften with recognition. A sip of cabbage soup, a crust of rye bread, a spoonful of coffee, it was enough to open the door to the past. And for a moment, time moved backward, and they were young again, standing in snow, waiting for food that tasted of endurance. As the decades turned, memory itself became gentle. Hunger was no longer pain, but understanding. It was the knowledge of limits, of fragility, of what it means to need and to be given. The quiet generation carried that understanding even without living it. It lived inside their gestures, inside their way of pausing before waste, of saving what could still be used, of giving more than they took. They did not call it remembrance, but that is what it was. In every family, there was at least one story passed down like a recipe. It began differently each time, sometimes with snow, sometimes with bread, sometimes with soup. But it always ended the same way, with gratitude. The words changed, the details faded, but the feeling remained, that food was not just food, that taste was memory, that memory was life. And when the old ones passed, their kitchens stayed behind, filled with their scent, their pans, their jars, their quiet order. The next generation entered those rooms carefully, touched the wooden spoons polished by years of use, the small pots darkened by fire. They kept them not because they were valuable, but because they were witnesses. The utensils had seen everything: hunger, hope, silence, renewal. In their wear and weight, they held the shape of history. Sometimes, late at night, a child or grandchild would find themselves standing in one of those kitchens, hearing the faint hum of the refrigerator, feeling the warmth of a room that had fed generations, and they would think of the stories told around those tables. They would not remember the words exactly, but they would remember the feeling, the stillness that came before a meal, the breath drawn before tasting, the invisible link between the living and the remembered. The quiet generation lived without needing to prove anything. They did not build monuments or write memoirs. Their lives were their record, measured in full plates, in laughter after long work, in the peace that came from enough. They passed on to their children something invisible yet enduring, a gentleness toward the world, a patience that came from knowing how fragile comfort really is. And so, time continued as softly as it had begun, moving from hunger to memory, from memory to gratitude, from gratitude to peace. The taste of bread changed, the flavor of soup evolved, but beneath every meal the same truth lingered. The truth that to eat is to remember, and to remember is to honor the life that made eating possible. Epilogue: The long silence of history. Night returns again, not as ending, but as memory, folding softly over the quiet world that has eaten, survived, and remembered. The light fades slowly, spreading across fields, rivers, and cities that once shook with hunger and noise. The houses stand still now, their windows dim, their kitchens clean, their stoves cold. The air holds no scent of war, only the faint trace of bread, the soft ghost of warmth that never fully disappears. Somewhere far away, the last echoes of the convoys dissolve into the horizon, and the sea at last becomes only sea again. Time has passed through the world like breath through glass, unseen yet certain. The generations that once stirred pots in darkness are gone, but the rhythm of their motion remains, carried in gestures, in recipes, in the patient sound of spoons. History has no voice of its own. It speaks through hands, through repetition, through quiet acts of care that outlast the noise that once defined it. Every time someone sets a table, or stirs a pot, or slices bread for another, the world repeats a prayer older than language, a vow made not to gods or nations, but to life itself. The long silence of history is not emptiness. It is the space where everything endured gathers and rests. The ships that crossed the frozen seas sleep now beneath calm water, their cargo long eaten, their names worn smooth by time. The fields once black with ash grow green again, the same soil feeding new roots. The kitchens once filled with smoke and hunger now hold the laughter of children who will never know those sounds. The world has not forgotten. It has simply learned to speak more softly. In that softness lies the truth of memory. History is not written in victories or ruins, but in continuance, in the way people keep moving, keep cooking, keep feeding one another. The past lingers in the scent of onions frying, in the scrape of a knife against wood, in the warmth of a bowl held between two hands. Every meal is an echo, and every echo is a bridge. There is a kind of peace that comes after too much noise, a peace that does not announce itself, that does not demand to be seen. It lives in small rooms, in steady breathing, in the slow quiet after long fear. Those who came before us built that peace not from wealth or power, but from patience. They took the fragments left behind and turned them into rhythm again. They taught the world that survival is not loud. It is gentle, repetitive, persistent. The world we inherit from them is quiet, but it is full. The lights of modern cities stretch across the dark like constellations drawn by human hands, yet beneath them the same truth glows. The need for warmth, for food, for closeness. No matter how far we travel from the fields or seas that once defined survival, we carry their lessons in our bones. We are never far from hunger, never far from gratitude, never far from the memory of the moment when the body met nourishment and knew it was alive. In the kitchens of now, stainless and bright, the gestures are the same. The stirring, the waiting, the tasting. The sound of water boiling is older than civilization, and the way steam rises is older than speech. We do not think of history when we eat, but it is there, folded into every motion, the knife that cuts, the salt that falls, the warmth that fills a room. All of it is memory continued, softened by time, but unbroken. Outside, the world keeps turning. The stars that once shone on soldiers, sailors, and farmers shines still, indifferent yet constant. The same light touches the roofs of sleeping towns, the decks of silent ships, the fields where grain grows again. It touches the faces of those who dream, those who have forgotten, those who remember without knowing why. The stars have always been witnesses, and their silence is the purest kind of remembrance. Sometimes, in the deep hours of night, when everything is still and the hum of life slows to a whisper, history breathes again. It moves not in dates or names, but in sensations. The chill of winter air, the taste of bread after hunger, the faint tremor of gratitude that comes without reason. It reminds us that nothing truly ends, that memory is simply time turned inward. Those who study the past often search for meaning in numbers, in victories, in loss, but meaning lives elsewhere, in the persistence of kindness, in the quiet continuation of simple acts. When one person feeds another, history continues. When someone chooses to share warmth, time deepens instead of passing. This is how humanity survives itself, not through conquest but through care. The silence that follows war is not empty. It is full of waiting, of renewal, of small voices learning again to speak. It takes generations for noise to fade, for the air to clear, for the world to trust itself with gentleness again. And yet, it always happens. The earth forgives by growing. The body forgives by sleeping. The soul forgives by remembering without pain. Now, as the night deepens, the world lies in that forgiveness. The wind moves softly through trees that grew from soil once broken. The rivers that carried ash now carry light. The oceans that swallowed ships now cradle reflections of stars. The fields are quiet, but they are alive. The kitchens are quiet, but they are full. And in that fullness, time rests. The long silence of history is not the end of the story. It is the breath taken before the next one begins. It is the moment when the fire burns low, when the hands fold, when the world exhales and feels its own weight. The sound of it cannot be recorded or written. It can only be felt in the pause between words, in the stillness between heartbeats. Somewhere, a kettle whistles softly. Somewhere, a child turns in sleep. Somewhere, an old man sits by a window, watching the moon rise over a street he no longer recognizes. The world continues in these quiet motions, each one a continuation of all that came before. The night is no longer fearful, it is patient. The dark no longer hides the past, it holds it. And as the last light fades, as the sky turns deep and blue and endless, history folds into itself once more. The fields, the seas, the cities, the kitchens, all of them drift into the same rhythm, the rhythm of breath, of calm, of peace. The war has long ended, the hunger has long been fed, and what remains is only the soft sound of life going on. The world sleeps and time sleeps with it.